So, Izabella, perhaps you could start by just talking about the specific situation, the specific circumstances of your cancellation of your two recently scheduled talks in Finland, how you came to be invited to give those talks in the first place, what happened to make both institutions. So, one was I'm going to pronounce this wrong, the Abo Akademi University. I have absolutely no idea if that's how it's pronounced, and I apologize to any Finnish speakers who are listening. And also the University of Helsinki. You were going to give the same talk at both places. And I'd first like to talk about how and why you were invited to give those talks, also what happened to cause the talks to be cancelled, and how that story has continued. And then maybe we can get on to the substance of the talk that you would have given had that
Sure.
talk gone forward.
Perfect. That sounds good. So I've been for many years researching the question of Soviet anti-Israel propaganda, Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda. I wrote a piece for Quillette about it, but I started actually, I think, in 2017. So it's been a number of years. Before that, I was researching and writing on the history of Soviet Jews and the Holocaust that happened in the Soviet territories during World War II. I'm originally from Russia. My master's degree is in Russian studies. So I'm a Russia person. All my life I've been a Russia person. I've always had jobs that had to do with Russia in one way or another. But for the last several years, since 2017 or so, I've really focused on the anti-Israel propaganda that the USSR developed and launched in the wake of the Six-Day War in 1967. We can talk about why I was researching that, but I'm saying this just to affirm that I had a name in the field, and it may sound immodest, but I think I have made a contribution to the field with my writings, with my research and writings. I have some academic publications, but I primarily have focused on writing for publications that write for general readers, because I thought that it was really important to help people understand, to help broader audiences understand it, and not let this material be locked in academic publications, because this propaganda still resonates on the far left. We still hear echoes of this propaganda today in the current anti-Zionist discourse. So that's kind of briefly my background on this. And so I think Abo Akademi is how I pronounce them, and I also don't know if it's correct. It's actually, I believe it's Swedish. It's a university that teaches in Swedish. There's a Swedish minority in Finland, which I learned. Yeah, I didn't realize that. But there is a group there that focuses on the study of anti-Semitism, and they invited me a very long time ago. I think the lead time was like a year, maybe 9 months in advance when we first started talking, and they really knew what they wanted. They knew why they wanted me. My expertise is actually pretty rare. Most people in the anti-Semitism studies focus on right-wing anti-Semitism, which is Nazi anti-Semitism and its derivatives. Very few people have really examined thoroughly the kind of anti-Semitism that I look at. And so they knew exactly why they wanted me. They knew where they wanted me. They knew the subject that they wanted. It was all very well thought out. The people who invited me are scholars themselves with substantial research output. So there were no accidents in this. It was all set. Then a week before I was supposed to fly, so it was a Wednesday of the week before actually, no, it was several days before we were supposed to fly. The conference was going to start on a Wednesday, I think last week of January, so a week before that, on a Wednesday, I got an email from organizers that there was a campaign against me on Finnish social media. And I think they phrased it very kind of politely and gently. And they said, people are writing and they're asking questions. And I said, well, what kind of questions are they asking? Let me know. Is there something I can answer? And then they said, well, it's more than just questions. It's a real smear campaign. I'm paraphrasing, but basically I understood what it was about. And why did I understand? Because we see so much of it in the US. Of course, we've seen it in various areas and fields for many years, certainly since 2020. But we see it, certainly those who deal with Israel and anti-Semitism and Zionism and Israel-Gaza conflict, we see this happening all the time. And by Friday, the universities caved, and I had the feeling that it might happen. I didn't know, because I didn't know much of anything about the academic culture in Finland. So I just kind of waited to see what would happen. And yeah, but Friday I got the email, the very embarrassed email from the organizers, who I can say now are my good friends and actually fought against the decisions of their universities. But they said, look, the rector of our university, or the dean of our university in that faculty where we are located, canceled, and also the University of Helsinki canceled. And that was it, but I had seen some of that. I asked them to send me screenshots of what was being posted. It was mostly on Instagram. There were a couple of accounts. They were all anonymous. One was called, I think, Researchers for Palestine. Another was called, I think, Students for Palestine, which is not the same as Students for Justice for Palestine. We don't know. So nobody really knows. You see, that's the problem with these campaigns, that they're anonymous. And so I saw that. They accused me. What happened is they looked at on my social media feeds. They looked on my X feed. They saw that I am pro-Israel. They saw that I questioned some of the dogmas that have been circulating, and some of them are just entirely incorrect in my view, and some are simply dogmatic and attempts to shut down debate. So they called me a genocide denier. They said that I was a apartheid supporting settler colonial, or legitimizing an apartheid settler colonial entity, and a couple of things like this. Again, things that we have all heard. And then there was also another fun touch, is that there was a mistake. Somebody on the organizers team added the magic 3 letters to my name, PhD, which I don't have and I never claim to have. They made a mistake. It happens to me at academic functions. People just assume that if you're speaking, it means that you're a PhD. So they claim that I misrepresented my academic credentials. The organizers say that as soon as they noticed, they removed the letters, but they noticed, and the campaigners noticed and attacked me on that. So that was briefly what happened. And then a whole other stage started, and we can talk about it.
It seems really extraordinary and almost unbelievable that you would be disinvited from a conference on anti-Semitism because you were pro-Israel.
Yes.
I mean, surely they would expect most speakers at a conference on anti-Semitism to be pro-Israel.
Maybe yes, maybe not. It's complicated in the Jewish community. There are Jews, students, professors who are vehemently anti-Israel. So I don't think that they necessarily expected that. But for me, the reason this was so ironic is that I'm Jewish myself. I grew up in the USSR. And the things that I write about, I come at it as a researcher, but I also tell my personal story. And I talk about how Soviet Jews were discriminated against at a time when the USSR was conducting its anti-Zionist campaign. So all of this language that we're hearing today, that Israel is a genocidal terrorist entity, settler colonial, apartheid, fascist, Nazi, etc., we've heard all of this. And we know, and this was part of the reason I was writing so insistently for many years and really trying to address myself to the broader audiences rather than academic audiences, is that we know what happens to Jews once this rhetoric takes over institutions and entire societies. You can claim all you want that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, but the outcomes, once that rhetoric takes over, once that way of thinking takes over, once that explanatory logic is there that positions Israel as kind of the heart of all evil in the universe, and anti-Semitic outcomes follow. And by the way, the campaigners, for them, kind of the ultimate sin that they accused me of was that I equated anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. So all of these things, they're a matter of debate, they're a matter of discussion, but they want everybody to think the same way and say the same things. And that too is extremely familiar to me as a former Soviet citizen.
Can you tell me, our listeners, something about the talk that you were going to give? So it was called, and you were going to give this talk at both places, From the Cold War to University Campuses Today, the USSR, the Third World, and Contemporary Anti-Zionist Discourse. Could you run us through what the main headers for that talk were going to be, what your main argument was going to be?
Sure. So this is, it's a talk. I give a version of this talk quite often. I give an overview of how the Soviet Union viewed Jews and Zionist Jews. And I start essentially with Lenin and Stalin, but then I focus primarily on what happened after 1967, because I think that is when Soviet anti-Zionism evolved into a whole new stage. It became it first of all went international, and or maybe first of all it became really comprehensive. They really developed this as a kind of body of rhetoric and thought, and they went international with it because they saw Israel's victory in the Six-Day War as a comprehensive challenge for the Soviet Union, in the Middle East, in the US also. In the US, because there were so many Jews, when the Soviets looked at the United States, they saw that there were so many Jews and they were influential. There were so many Jews in influential places, which was very unusual for the Soviet Union, and they immediately saw it as suspicious. And these Jews were pro-Israel. And they saw it also as an internal challenge because the Six-Day War kind of stirred Jewish nationalism inside the country, and Soviet Jews started to connect to their Jewish identity far more than they had been permitted before. They started wanting to emigrate to Israel. So a whole campaign also inside the country started for emigration. And the Soviets, because Soviet political culture, as often happens in authoritarian and totalitarian states, was prone to conspiracy theories and paranoia. And this is only like 15 years after Stalin died, or less than 15 years. They connected all the dots in a real global way. So they said, well, our Jews in the USSR want to emigrate because Zionists outside the country are trying to undermine us. So there is and by the way, also a global campaign begins in the US, in Australia, in the UK, in support of Soviet Jews. And so, they look at it, they're like, whoa, Jews are masterminding. Zionists are masterminding. They don't use the word Jews as often, although sometimes they slip because they understand that it's kind of a Nazi far-right rhetoric. So they substitute that with Zionists. And they say, well, Zionists are masterminding this campaign. And so this is what I would have talked about. I have beautiful slides that accompany this lecture. And I would have added here also in this lecture the fact that the USSR also had significant influence in the developing world, which was at the time called the Third World, the post-colonial world. It's intentionally sought to establish itself as a dominant force there. And so I would have talked about how some of the people who are really still prominent in the anti-Israel campaigns, like Angela Davis, like George Galloway, like there's a bunch of people, people who were Jeremy Corbyn's advisors, they participated in this particular ecosystem that the Soviets helped shape that was essentially a global left ecosystem where people interacted with one another and normalized the kind of language that we're still hearing today. So this would have been the talk. I would not have even brought in, I would have made it clear that I am pro-Israel. But the current Gaza-Israel conflict was not going to be part of the lecture at all. It would have been a strictly historical lecture with some implications for the contemporary moment. And there are versions of this lecture floating on the internet, because I've given it before, and there are webinars somewhere out there.
So could you give me an example or two of the way in which that rhetoric was used in the Third World or in Third World contexts?
Sure. So I've written about it for Tablet, and this is now going to be it's now an academic piece that will be published soon in a collection of essays. So what's really interesting is the Soviets they segmented as good marketers and propagandists, right? They knew how to sell information, and so they segmented their anti-Zionist propaganda depending on who they're speaking to. So they knew that when you talk to Europeans, you equate Zionists with Nazis. That really resonates, right? Because everybody's historical memory of World War II is really strong. And especially, again, going back, it's 1967. It's only 20 years after the war. Clear reference, clear as, 100% understood. When they wanted to smear Zionism in Africa, and there were additional nuances because Israelis were becoming involved in the African countries. There were technology transfers. They were trying to help African states and establish connections. And the Soviets saw that also as a threat to their dominance because they viewed the continent as theirs. And they thought that Israelis are bringing with them American influence. So this is kind of this whole positioning, geopolitical positioning. But they understood that if you come to Africa and say, well, Zionists are Nazis, it doesn't resonate as heavily because the cultural memory is different. And so when they went to Africa, they talked about Zionists are racists, or they would say they invented this whole story, or not so much invented. Of course, Jews were involved in South African mining industry, 100%. But it's the question of how you like twist it, right? So they took it to say, well, Jews in South Africa, rich Jews, billionaires in South Africa, supporting Israel, participating in apartheid. And so they would say, well, Zionists are also, they promote apartheid, and Israel is like, it's similar to South African apartheid. So these are some of the examples, and you see it in the publications. There is a publication called The African Communist, which I reference in that piece in Tablet. And you see how it's what's interesting about it is, you look at British left-wing publications, which the Soviets sponsored. I said myself, I'm going to backtrack a little bit. So as I was exploring this subject and trying to understand how is it that this kind of Soviet rhetoric traveled to the rest of the world, because I really didn't know that when I first started. But what I understood is that you don't just reinvent an entire kind of body of rhetoric from scratch. So I was sure that I would discover some ways in which it was communicated to all these countries. So I started reading left-wing publications that I knew had been sponsored by the Soviets. So I knew that if the Soviets sponsored them, it meant that they would impose certain editorial requirements. And so you look at British left-wing, far-left publications from the late 60s, 70s, and 80s. You look at American, CPUSA, Communist Party of the United States. You look at their publications. You look at the publications of South Africa that you knew were associated with the Communist Party of South Africa, as well as the ANC, and which were closely intertwined. And you see the same language all of a sudden appearing in 1967. And you just know that there's one source. So that's...
Yeah. Is that so that publicity that happened in 1960s, that began in 1967, the Soviet anti-Zionist publicity, which I've seen examples of in your articles for Quillette, and I'll link to those, and also to the video that we made for Quillette of one of the articles, which showcases the visual material. And there are very striking similarities in both the iconography and the language of that Soviet propaganda and modern day posters that Students for Justice in Palestine and Jewish Voice for Peace and other groups are putting up around university campuses, and that we're seeing in quote-unquote pro-Palestine leftist accounts on social media. And is that also, do you think, the kind of the origin of this Holocaust inversion trope, which is the idea, would sum it up like this, that the Jews have become the new Nazis, and in fact that somehow, because the Holocaust happened to the Jews, they learned from it and became Nazis in their turn, as if there was some kind of, as if you're kind of fated, if you become a victim, to become a victimizer in the same kind of vein, which is an idea we might want to go into in a bit more depth later. But is that the origin of that Holocaust inversion stuff?
Well, the Soviets very actively traded in this, very actively. And here, what's interesting about it is that I don't think they were necessarily the first to compare Zionists to Nazis. I've learned from some research. Leslie Clough in the UK pointed out that actually Robert Wistrich, who was a great historian of anti-Semitism, pointed out that already the British Foreign Office, actually, there were people in the British Foreign Office, I think in the days when, of course, the British were in Palestine, and they very much felt confronted by the Zionist Jews in Palestine, who really wanted them to be gone. I mean, it was really a decolonization movement, but they were equating Zionists with Nazis already. So in the 30s, I think in the 40s probably. But the Soviets were the ones who are 100% responsible for universalizing it, for making it available for public consumption, for broad public consumption, and for really kind of working this point to death, we could say that, in cartoons, in articles, and using it over and over and over again. And that is 100% an influence that comes from there. You see the Soviets use, that's like, because they had such a close interaction with the Nazis, and because they took control of some of the Nazi archives, I believe, they would say, well, look, we have some documents that show here's what the Nazis did. And the Zionists collaborated with the Nazis in the 90s. And not only did they collaborate, but they collaborated in the annihilation of their own people. The Zionist Jews collaborated in the Holocaust with the Nazis. And I tracked this. I tried to understand this as I was writing a piece about Mahmoud Abbas's dissertation, which he defended in the USSR in the 90s. I looked at, and at the time I didn't have the whole dissertation. Now I do. But at the time I only had 11 pages, kind of the introduction to the dissertation. But I tracked.
So I'll just say this is Mahmoud Abbas, who is the head of the Palestinian Authority. Is that correct? In the West Bank?
Exactly. So I looked at his dissertation and I looked at the references, or at the introduction to the dissertation, very extended abstract, and at the references. And he says there this thing that Zionists were allowed to go into concentration camps, and they like pick out the people that they wanted to free, like just crazy things, that were completely ahistorical. And I knew that other Soviet propaganda about Israel had said the same. But here I had references. And so I thought, okay, I want to go to those references. Why is he, what is he saying? Where is he taking this from? And I understood that what they meant is that there were Jews, it's of course well known that there were Jews who, kapos, right? The Jews who were kapos, it's a Jewish term, but like Jews who were part of the Judenrats, the Jewish councils that the Nazis formed in the occupied territories, which they wanted to help them deal with the Jewish population. So it's a controversial topic. It's a very painful topic. But what Abbas does, and this is what Soviet propagandists do, is they look at these Jews and they see that in the pre-war years, they had been involved in the Zionist movements. And, Zionist movements in the pre-war years were so widely kind of popular and spread. And it wasn't anything remarkable. It didn't mean that the person then continued being, I don't know, a Zionist activist. He just participated in a movement, in a youth movement. These were mostly youth movements. But what they do, and this is how you can see how they twist reality and how they twist the truth. They see that in this biography as a young person, as a teenager or something, there was this line that they had been part of a youth Zionist movement. And so then they identify this person as a Zionist. And then they say, well, it was Zionists who collaborated with the Nazis. It was Zionists who were members who comprised these Jewish councils. And they were the ones who collaborated against their own people. So it's an incredibly, it's not just a historical, it's also a really evil twist, right? They're playing on a tragedy of the Jewish people. It's, I don't know if evil is the right term, but that's the term that comes to my mind. Really, truly twisted way to manipulate a deeply tragic history.
It's also a kind of there's like a soft Holocaust denialism going on here, because if you're comparing what happened in the Holocaust to a country fighting a more normal form of warfare as we have in Israel today, then what you are saying is the Holocaust, that was just what the Germans did during the Holocaust, what the Nazis did during the Holocaust, was just another conflict, another form of warfare. And this is also something that I'm hearing as a very widespread anti-Semitic trope from people who are on I would say, the fringe left. I'm not really hearing this in the mainstream pro-Palestinian leftist movement, but on the fringes of that, and definitely all of the Islamist hangers-on to that movement. What I'm hearing is there was nothing special about the Holocaust. The only reason why we are always talking about the Holocaust is because it happened to Jews, and therefore it's one more way in which Jews are asserting that they're special, because everybody should feel sorry for them for what happened in the Holocaust. And in fact, many tragedies have happened throughout history. This is just one more tragedy. So there's a really strong relativization and minimization going on. And it's weirdly, we shouldn't expect this kind of ideology to make sense, to make logical sense, but it's weirdly conflicting with some of the things that have been said about Hamas and Hamas's actions, which is that I think that early on in this whole latest episode, just after 7th October, and in fact just after the first hostages were released and things, there was um, a tendency to try to justify what Hamas was doing, which now people have switched over into denialism, which I think is perhaps something of an ethical advance, that now they've realized that can't be justified, so they've gone straight over into, well, it didn't happen. But at the beginning there was a lot of justification, and some of the justification took this form of, well, if they're doing such terrible things right now, like mass rape and torture and murder and things, it must be because they just can't help it, because what happened to them was so awful, there's no other way to respond, which is a really bizarre logic, a really strange logic, and is completely contradicted by history. There's never been any movement in which German Jews have kidnapped people or
Exactly.
raped Germans or
Right. Exactly.
taken German hostages or tortured Germans in retaliation.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's a trope of literature, not necessarily anti-Semitic literature, but it's a trope I've encountered in some literary works. There's a famous play, I can't remember what it is, but it's about a woman who is raped, and then she takes her rapist hostage, and she subjects him to mental and physical torture over a long period. And your sympathies over the course of this play shift from her to him. But there's an underlying kind of logic of, if you've done something really terrible, you must have had a really good reason. And
Right.
that's a trope in literature, but it just doesn't tend to play out in real life.
Right. Well, and I think this is what Israelis often point out, that there is a difference in understanding. Westerners often have a hard time understanding this conflict and processing it, because I think there is something in the Western psyche that makes it really hard to understand that people are capable of such barbarism, because and I mean, I think we can go into why that may be. If you look at Hamas's ideology, look at their charter, it's very clear they hate Jews. They don't consider Jews to be human. But I think it's very hard for people to understand that you can just come up with something like that and do something like that without a good reason. And this is where, again, Soviet propaganda really played into it. The whole idea that imposing that oppressive versus oppressed lens. I mean, it's almost, again, it's funny for me to see Westerners discover this perspective and say, well, this is some kind of a new framework that the young people are applying. I mean, fundamentally, it's a neo-Marxist framework. I mean, it's grounded in the Marxist view of the world. I mean, the proletarian revolution was supposed to be an uprising of the oppressed versus the oppressor. It's just that today it's actually some orthodox leftists, orthodox Marxists would say that it's actually much more dysfunctional, because at least in classical Marxism, when you're defining oppressor versus oppressed in economic terms, the proletariat, when you are a member of the oppressed class, you have a path to improve your situation. We can argue with whether we agree with that path or not, but you have it. There's a clear path. If your oppression is defined by the color of your skin or by your gender, then it's a really nihilistic ideology. Then there's nothing you can do about it. But anyway, that framework is very old also, and the Soviets applied it in full to this conflict. And they compared it to Nazi Germany, and in the same breath, they would talk about how the oppressed Palestinian people were rising up against the oppressor. So we've seen it all, but I think that it does play into some psychological kind of processes, perhaps, in which the Western mind thinks. And which don't help to really process the conflict. I don't want to say correctly, but in a way that's close to reality, describes the conflict in more realistic terms.
Yeah, there's also something almost quite mechanistic about this way of viewing the world. You have bad things done to you, and then you rise up and you do bad things to other people, and this kind of cycle continues, which is not actually how most conflicts or how most historical atrocities have taken place. There have, of course, been cycles of violence and vengeance on both sides that we have seen historically. I'm thinking particularly of partition in India, and I highly recommend the book Midnight's Furies, which is a horrifyingly detailed account of what happened there. In general, this is a very it's a programmatic, schematic way of viewing the world, that each group has its kind of role determined by where you are in some sort of wheel of history.
Yes, well, and also when I first encountered this, and this was this idea that Jews had been victimized and now they become victimizers, I first saw it already years ago in the US. And I remember thinking that it's some kind of like being curious about it, but I've never actually researched it. And now maybe I will after we've had this conversation. It seems some kind of a pop psychology kind of at play here. I'm sure it comes from some kind of a psychological theory that if you've been a victimizer or victimized, you become a victim. And again, it applies to only people apply it to Jews. I don't think they apply it to other people. There's just something about.
I have heard it before in other contexts. So, for
Mm,
example, I've very often heard the idea that people who are sexually abused children, it's because they were sexually abused as children.
mm-hmm,
This doesn't make a lot of sense, since it's mostly girls who are sexually abused as children, I believe. I mean, of course, are also many boys to whom this happens. I don't want to minimize that, but in numerical terms, it's much more commonly girls, and it's much more commonly men who are the abusers. I'm talking specifically about sexual abuse here. And I think part of that, the desire for those kinds of explanations, at least in the case of childhood sex abuse, is a blank slatist philosophy, which is the kind of flat eartherism of the left, as I always describe it, but really hard to for people to get away from the question of, if you're doing something evil, you began as basically a good person, so something must have happened to you to cause you to do this
mm-hmm,
evil thing.
mm-hmm,
Um, Of course, this is slightly different from the situation we're talking about here, because there isn't a lot of propaganda, brainwashing. There isn't a whole ideology that goes along with being a childhood sex abuser. There isn't. You're not brainwashed from childhood into believing this would be a good thing. You don't do little plays at primary school where you act it out. On the contrary, it's one of the most feared and hated and excoriated acts. But yeah, there's some kind of weird blank slatist ideology also at work there. And I
mm-hmm.
think that's part of what has made some leftists so keen to jump on this bandwagon, to believe that if Hamas and Hamas supporters are doing terrible things, it must be as a result of having been wronged in their turn. So they must have begun somehow with this core of deep goodness, that some terrible trauma must have happened to shift it
Right,
over.
right. I want to add something else going back to that idea that Jews had been victims and then they became victimizers. Very often, I think what I find, and I think a lot of Jews find so offensive about it, I'll just speak for myself. What I find so offensive about it is that, first of all, it's often delivered with fake compassion. You know, today people don't bother to add it, but, outside of like sharp moments of periods of sharp conflict, or when this conflict is in full global view, people talk about it like, well, yes, we understand why Jews would do this. They were victimized. And so there is like this fake compassion, but then there is a corollary to that. And sometimes people will go into it and they will say, I would have thought the Jews, as the most oppressed people who have suffered so much, would have learned from their suffering to be much more compassionate and to really, to never to never kill another person or never do anything painful to another human being. And what's so dysfunctional about it and what's so bizarre and offensive about it actually is that so you're saying that it's like the implication is that the Holocaust was sort of a finishing school for Jews, right? It was supposed to be this moral cleanser. It's like Jews had been bad before, they went through the Holocaust, it's supposed to have cleansed them to the point where they are now expected to actually be better than others, so that when they are being killed, they should not respond. When their babies are being kidnapped and strangled and mutilated, they should be above it because they've gone through the Holocaust. They've gone through this finishing school. So they're morally above everybody else. And the truth is, the only thing, I think Israelis like to say it, is that the only thing that Jews should have learned and needed to learn from the Holocaust, the only lesson they learned, and Israelis in fact did learn this lesson, is that they should never be vulnerable again. And they need to have an army and defend themselves so that others can never do these things to them again. That is the only reasonable lesson one should expect from any nation that has undergone a genocide. So there are kind of subtexts and layers to this that are really, I don't know how to characterize it, just twisted, really twisted.
Yeah, very twisted. Can you talk a little bit about growing up in the Soviet Union as a Jew? How much did this, clearly the Soviet anti-Semitism didn't begin in 1967. And can you talk a little bit about your personal experiences of it and perhaps how you think that this fits into a longer tradition of Russian anti-Semitism?
Yeah, wow. Tell me how much time you have, because I could give you like a 3-hour lecture on this now. um, well, look, I trace my family back to my great grandparents' generation, approximately, which for Soviet Jews is actually pretty long because a lot of us, in the USSR, they suppressed a lot of things about the past, including, family history research was really not allowed. And people just suppressed their family history because they knew it could get them into trouble. But as I'm thinking about it, my great grandmother was born that I actually got to know personally. She lived a long life. She was born at a time when the protocols of the Elders of Zion, probably right around then, I think it was 1880s. So she would have come of age when the protocols would have been published. And the protocols of the Elders of Zion are kind of this central book that compiles all of the anti-Semitic tropes that we're so familiar with that have become classics. They heavily influenced they heavily influenced the pogroms against Russian Jews. They spurred pogroms. The pogromist far-right Russian parties used the protocols to justify pogroms against Russian Jews. This is even before the revolution. And then the Nazis were really influenced by them and used their tropes. And I'm saying this because, to show the continuity, it's one of the things that I came to understand through my research is that when the Soviets started to put together their campaign that we're talking about now, the post-67 campaign, they altered the language so that they wouldn't sound like the Nazis. So they largely don't talk about Jews, although sometimes they do. They mostly talk about Zionists. But the tropes remain the same. And this is what makes this propaganda anti-Semitic. When people say, well, it's anti-Zionist, therefore it criticizes Zionism, therefore it criticizes Israel, it's legitimate criticism, it's not anti-Semitic. Well, there are differences. There are different ways in which you can criticize. And so the ideology that we're talking about today is grounded. It talks about Zionists, but underlying it are the same tropes that we find in the protocols of the Elders of Zion. So Jewish greed, Jewish treachery, the idea that Jews control, Zionists control, right? Jews/Zionists control all the media, they control all the politics, they control the banks, they hold all the money in their hands, they want to influence the world for their benefit, and so on and so forth. So if you were a Jewish family in the Soviet Union that traces its history, let's say, to the 80s, and 1880s, by the way, is the time when millions of Russian Jews from the Russian Empire emigrated to America because of the pogroms that were happening. And that's really the origin of American Jewry as we know it today. So if you can trace this history like 150 years back, it is throughout a history of anti-Semitic prejudice and anti-Semitic oppression. The specific form may change. And so it changed. It was one way under Lenin, it was a different way under Stalin. After Stalin, it changes shape again. But throughout all of it, Jews find themselves a target of oppression. So even as, and I wrote about it in the article in which I talked about the cancellation of my lectures in Finland. So in the 60s and 70s, the conversation around you is around, and I was born in 1970, which I always announce to people in my lectures and in all of my talks, because I want people to understand that I experienced it. I didn't come to the US at the age of 5. I actually lived in the Soviet Union until I was 19, and then we emigrated. So if you were a child then you are being, you experience bullying in school as a Jew, but the bullying comes like as spurred perhaps by something that the kids heard on the news, which is that the Zionists took over the Golan Heights. My friend Maxim Schreier quotes that, and I quote him in the article in Tablet. The Zionists have, I don't know, the Zionists oppress Palestinians. Therefore, let's go and beat up the Jewish kid in my school. So I remember growing up hearing a lot of just kind of, I was never beaten up, but just like whispers behind you. I actually have a very clear memory of standing in line, those classic long lines for food that you had to stand in for hours. And I'm standing in line. There was something that the store had that we needed. And somebody behind me kind of pushes me, a grown-up woman. I think I was a teenager. She's sort of or you know what it is that I moved awkwardly. And I think I may have stepped on her foot or something like that, And she just hissed this anti-Semitic thing at me. What are you doing here? Go to your Israel. This is the thing that in the USSR they used to say. What are you Jews doing here? If you are Zionists, you love your Israel so much. This is what our newspapers are telling us. Well, why don't you go to Israel? Which is, another joke. It's just a joke among Jews as well. You are in a repressive regime. They tell you go to Israel. It's what they told Jews in Poland in the 1960s. Now they're saying Jews get out of Israel, Well, where should we go? And then I had an issue getting into a college in the USSR. So I was obviously old enough. I was college age. At 17, I think, is when I applied. My exams were I got the top marks. The entrance exams in the USSR were in person. And I was warned, I was told, first of all, even before I applied, I was told, don't even try to apply to this school or that school. They never take Jews. And then the school that I chose, they told me that the person who is, bless you, the person who is, who is, I'm now blanking for a term. It was a history exam. And so the person who is what received
the invigilator? The invigilator?
I don't even know that word. The person
that's the person supervising the exam.
Well, I guess so. He was the one that. So let me explain the process. So you walk in and you pick a question. You don't know what it is. It's obviously, you don't know what it's like a lottery draw. You pick a question, you sit down, you think about it, and then you come and you answer, and this person listens to you. He's like a professor of history. So I was told that he's known for his anti-Semitism. He never lets any Jews pass. And of course, when it's an in-person exam, they identify you. You don't even need to present your passport. They just identify you by your looks. This is how it was in Slavic countries. They could just tell that you're a Jew by looking at your facial features. And I, I've thought about it. I've gone back to that, over the years, and I was so naive. I was thinking, 17-year-old, I'm thinking, well, he couldn't reject me just for that. I mean, I'm so smart and I'm so charming and I'm going to be extra nice to him. Why would he reject me? And I passed all of the exams with flying colors. And then I'm not on the list of students who've been admitted. And we had this moment in my family. I think it's the first time I'm talking about it in public. So this was in Moscow. We lived in Novosibirsk, but I really wanted to go to school in Moscow. And we were staying with my parents' friends. And I really could not process an injustice. As a 17-year-old, I just could not comprehend it, because here I was. I had done my utmost best. I had worked my bum off to prepare for these exams, and I really wanted to live in Moscow. And they tell me no. And not only did I put my best effort, I actually achieved excellent results, and they're rejecting me. And this is my dad's story now, where he says that he remembers that I walked out onto a balcony at our friend's home, and I guess I just started crying. And my dad, like, something in his father's heart just broke in that moment. And he realized that he just couldn't. First of all, he was helpless in a way. And he understood that this was like, he needed to try to do something. And the thing that helped us in that moment, actually, was that it was already perestroika. It was already the reform. Gorbachev was in power. There was more freedom. This is like 87, approximately 87, 88, something like that. And the press was becoming more free. And so my dad started asking or thinking, talking to friends, like, what can I do? Can we appeal? What can we do? And somebody said to him, go to this reporter or maybe editor, go to this journalist in this really influential newspaper. She covers higher education, and she has been really courageous in what she says. And go and tell her the story of what happened to your girl. So my dad went, and I guess I asked him recently, so what happened in that conversation? And he, I think we only had a few days really to appeal this decision. Not appeal, but there wasn't a real process to appeal, but like to do something about this decision. And he couldn't even remember clearly, but he says, basically, she said to him, go tell them that you talked to me. Go back and tell them you talked to me. And if they don't take your daughter, then they will hear from me. And this is what he did. And the next day, my name magically appeared on the list of those accepted. And so I spent 2 years in that school, and then we emigrated. And the thing about this story is that, it's like we won, but it was a victory with no joy, because it was such a hard victory. And you understood that if you stayed there in that country, you would be fighting every stage of the way. And there's just no way that you'd be able to invest so much energy and so much effort into getting what really should be yours in the first place, right? So it's like talking about meritocracy. I think that's why Soviet Jews who emigrated from the USSR are really real devotees of meritocracy, because we've seen how these kinds of prejudices, we've seen how the Soviets really used, ethnic quotas and all kinds of things, and we see how it distorts things. And honestly, I think when I came to America, I just felt so free, because I didn't have to do anything or be anything except just put my best effort and then see what results it brings.
I want to return a little bit to your talk in Finland. So one of the things that you talk about in Tablet, where you're discussing the cancellation, is the history of Finnish collusion with Soviet anti-Semitism. Could you say a little bit more about the specifically Finnish background?
Well, here I don't want to step out of my lane. I really don't know. I'm not an expert on Finnish history, but the reason I remember this is that, first of all, my Finnish friends, and I made good friends in Finland as a result of this episode, kept talking to me about Finlandization and how Finland was supposed to be basically neutral politically during the Cold War, in exchange for remaining independent. Finnish territories used to be part of the Russian Empire. And then it so happened that it won its independence. And then in exchange for maintaining this independence, in exchange for not becoming part of the Soviet Union, it agreed to be neutral politically. I mean, in reality, it was pulled into the Soviet orbit because the Soviet Union is so huge and it's right next to your border. It's right on your border. No, but there is a history of Lenin. Like a lot of Soviet people, when they hear about Finland, they will think about the history. I should say, people of a certain generation. They will remember that Lenin spent a lot of time in Finland before the revolution. He was there in exile, and he went there before the revolution. And when he arrived in 1917 from the exile on his famous German train, sealed train. He arrived at the Finnish station in Leningrad, Finland Station, it was called. And that moment is really sort of seared into everybody's consciousness, again, of people of a certain age, because it was so propagandized. Like, this was this great triumphant arrival, red banners, and soon Lenin comes out with his April thesis. This is April of 1917, and this is from here, the road is paved toward the revolution in October. So it sort of is there in our consciousness. And then as I was writing this article, I also learned that actually Lenin and Stalin first met in Finland at a Bolshevik conference in Finland in 1905. But then during the Cold War, Finland, just like a lot of places that were, I mean, I understood that perhaps it was, of course, a Western country, it was a capitalist country, but the Soviet influence was so strong that there was self-censorship. It really was a cultural taboo to criticize the Soviet Union. Some Finnish intellectuals also went with the Soviet influence, and they took on Finnish ideology, or they took on, Soviet ideology and Marxism. And there is a really interesting example that I also just learned as I was researching this article, is that in the 1970s, there was a scandal that broke out in one municipality when it turned out that this municipality had inserted actual Soviet educational material into children's school books. I think children from like a very young age until, I don't know, the 9th grade or something like that. And that was clearly the influence of.
Sorry, when was this? What year was this?
So this is the 1970s, the 70s. And, the things that it just makes me smile, again, it's just such kind of boilerplate Soviet propaganda about how there was no pollution in the USSR, and how the planned economy was so much better than capitalist economy, and how in order to create social change, you need to have a workers' revolution, so really like, hardcore boilerplate stuff that, by the way, in the 1970s and 80s, nobody in the USSR even took seriously anymore. And yet here you have these Finnish Marxists inserting this material into their school children's textbooks, and which reminds me of another joke, which I think actually may come from something that I think it may be real, is that the KGB in the 70s and 80s actually understood that the real believers are in the West, so Western leftists who are the real believers. In the USSR, all of this was so like, can't hear this anymore. We certainly don't believe in this. So there was that history, and I found names of some Finnish intellectuals who participated in the Soviet anti-Israel campaign. And those names I've had from a while ago, because, as I was doing my research, I just noted for myself all of the foreign names that I saw, foreign authors who were published in Soviet anti-Zionist, anti-Israel literature, just so that I could research them further. And so I very quickly, I had a mental note that there were Finnish names, and so I went and I found them. So they were part of it. Not all of Finland, let's put it that way, but some Finnish intellectuals and political actors were fellow travelers and supported and were part of the supported the Soviet view of the world and helped inculcate it in Finland. And I'm told, by the way, that to this day, I don't know if it's true, again, this is all fairly recent knowledge for me, but I've been told by several people that part of Cold War history, that Finland hasn't really fully processed it, and there hasn't really been kind of a national discussion of it. Again, I'm just transmitting what my Finnish friends told me.
So I know there have been some developments since. So I know that the first thing you did was, in the case of the Abu Academy University, I believe, you sent them. So the people who are organizing the seminar on anti-Semitism, they were fighting for your continued inclusion, and they were overruled by the university. And they suggested that you send an article to be read in place of your talk. And the article you chose was one of your two Quillette articles, and it's called, I think, I'm going to find it, Soviet Life Taught Me About Censorship.
Yes.
And could you say a little bit about why you chose that article and how that's related?
Sure. But first, I want to give credit to the organizers, to the people who really took on this fight, because, they were fighting against their bosses, against their superiors. It's not to be taken for granted. And what they decided, they told me, is when they immediately, just like me, identified this as a case of censorship, of political censorship. It was really obvious. And when my participation was canceled, they said first that they were they're not gonna cross me off the program. They're not going to invite another speaker or put another speaker in my slot. They would let the silence and the absence speak for itself, which I thought was already very powerful. And then we started talking more, and they said, well, can you send us something that we could read out to people in that place? And I immediately thought about this piece. And I mean, I thought about it because, again, this was a clear case of censorship. And because in my original lecture, I was going to talk about my experience, about my lived experience, to use a cliche, of being a Jew in the Soviet Union and experiencing this propaganda firsthand, I thought, well, I might as well send an article that also talks about my experience with censorship in the Soviet society and what it was like for me to come to the West and experience freedom of consciousness and of conscience and freedom of thought and freedom of opinion and how intoxicating it was. And then to see that freedom being infringed upon in 2020 onward. So I thought that this was an appropriate choice.
Thanks. And I know there have been developments since. You were saying that the story continues. Can you tell us about what's happened
Sure.
since?
Yeah. So first of all, I think I did mention that when my talks were canceled, I mean, I understood what happened. I understood that it was the anti-Israel campaigners who influenced the decision. But then I anyway thought that the universities owed me an explanation. I really wanted to hear how they justify this cancellation for themselves. I wanted to hear what they would say. And so I sent an identical letter to both universities where I explained my credentials because my credentials were put in question. So I explained that. I explained what I was going to speak about. I explained my Jewish background. And I think I said that what happened was a replay for me of what I would have experienced in the USSR. And in fact, experienced versions of it, this kind of academic anti-Semitism couched in the language of social justice and anti-Zionism and criticism of Israel. And they responded. So I wrote to the rectors of the two universities and to the deans of the two faculties where I knew the talks were going to be held. And I also wrote to a professor at Helsinki. I wrote to a professor who actually, I wrote to those two. And then this professor responded to me. So anyway, I was then corresponding with two people from one person at each university. And that the correspondence just proved to me that they weren't honest. They hadn't, surprisingly, they sort of admitted it unintentionally that they had not really done any research on who I was. I think that they experienced the heat of the campaign. The campaigners spurred, other academics in these schools to write to them. And I think for them, it was a no-brainer to cancel a speaker. And here I'll add, I mean, I don't like to use these accusations very often, but I do think that they just thought, okay, it's just some woman. We don't know who she is. It's a no-brainer just to cancel her. I do think, I don't know, we can speculate, but I think they wouldn't have done it if, I don't know, if the speaker was, I don't know, a bearded man who looked very authoritative. But but we can set that aside. I mean, it's just a thought. But it was a default choice for them. They thought this is not a famous name. We're just going to cancel it. So, and then when I came around asking questions, they didn't really know what to say. And so there were convoluted kind of emails from one person, and then there were deflections from another person. And it was very educational. It was educational. But what's interesting about this case that I find that I think made it worth writing about, because just the cancellations themselves are not really news, but what's really interesting is that it backfired on the censors. And it backfired already as I was writing the tablet article. And it has continued to backfire since then, because the media, actually, the discussion hasn't stopped. It's hard for me to judge. I don't read Finnish. I don't read Swedish. These are the two languages in which the discussion has been taking place. It's hard for me to understand how far it has reached into kind of national conversation, national consciousness. I understand that the main Finnish newspaper, the highest circulation newspaper, Helsingin Sanomat, they didn't interview me. They wrote a short piece about it, and they told me that I could write a comment that would be 500 characters. I said to them, well, if you want, I can give you a full interview. They never asked for it. But the discussion continues on blogs. It continues on podcasts. My piece has now been translated into Greek. There's like when it happened, when my piece got published, hundreds of Finns came to my X account to express support. And so I think just yesterday, I sort of did a bit of trolling and I wrote that, okay, yet another podcast, yet another discussion, translation into Greek. Abo Akademi, Helsinki University, are you regretting your decisions yet? And I think, and this is something that I also wrote to those people that I was corresponding with at the universities, that they thought that by canceling the lectures, they're removing the problem. Well, they actually invited the problem because now the issues, because how many people would have come to my lectures? Honestly, realistically, I don't know, 100, 150 together cumulatively at both places. Let's say 200 to be most optimistic. I'm sure no media outlets would have covered it. It would have been a non-event. I would have just delivered this lecture, which I've delivered multiple times in multiple places. But now it sparked a discussion, and the discussion is wide-ranging, and it includes anti-Semitism and academic anti-Semitism and the role of universities in the democratic societies and what values the universities uphold. Because, of course, both of the universities have these highfalutin values, which they clearly did not uphold in my case. Freedom of speech, freedom of thought, and then, of course, also Israel and Zionism and anti-Zionism, and also Finland's role during the Cold War also comes up because I wrote about it. In this case, I mean, this is, a kind of joke. I say that, aspiring censors really should study this case and recognize that it's dangerous to censor because an issue can explode.
Absolutely. Izabella, is there anything that you wish I had asked you that I haven't asked you, or you feel that should be emphasized that you haven't had a chance to emphasize?
I think this pretty much covers it. I'll add that I now have an invitation to come back to Finland and give
Good.
lectures. So yet another lesson. I really honestly think this is the moral of the story. Well, let's just stop the censorship stuff. It's just we need to get back to, when I came to the United States, the thing that really jumped out at me is how confident the American society was in itself, in its democracy, in its security, kind of inner stability, that there were people all over the place in the newspapers criticizing the country, attacking the government, and yet it was all completely allowed. And to me, it was a sign of confidence. And I think we need to go back to basics and recognize that, in a liberal democracy, it's what makes us strong. I know it sounds like a cliche, but I just say it again as someone who comes from behind the Iron Curtain, who recognized it from my own experience. It's like freedom of thought and freedom of speech are fundamental. So let's allow it again.
Thank you. I think that's a great note to end on. It's been a pleasure, Isabel. It's lovely to actually see your face finally, after dealing with your writing, reading your writing and editing some of your pieces also for a few years now.
Thank you so much,
It's
Iona.
great to have you on
It's
the
a pleasure,
podcast.
and I feel the same way. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.